Hey, howdy, hey, my brewing brothers and sisters. We're live here with my good friend Fal Allen from Anderson Valley Brewing Company, live on Facebook. And if you're listening live, go to the little chat there, the live chat, and you can ask your questions of Fal or myself, whatever questions you have brewing related. The show is being sponsored by Blickman Engineering. I don't know, Fal, have you ever had anything to do with John Blickman?
I know John a little bit, but we don't have any of his equipment, I don't think. I hear that it's quite good.
It is. And he makes stuff from, the um, more basic anvil brewing equipment up to the Blickman Engineering stuff and even pro size. So if you're a home brewer and you really want to have some great equipment to innovate your brew day, check out Blickman Engineering, blickmanengineering.com. And if you're wanting to go pro, they have, I think, everything up to 10 barrel systems now. So quite the range of great equipment. Earlier this year, I was on the road in Germany with a friend of mine, Jason Ledford from True Symmetry Brewing. And one of the places we stopped in was Dusseldorf, alt beer. Some of my favorite. I've got my Schlussel shirt on right here. Yeah.
Very nice.
And one of my favorites there. And it got me thinking about, alt beer is, old style ale is what what you hear from all the pundits. And it got me thinking about, what other old styles are there? I mean, that's, one old beer. I guess they've been brewing beer there for 800 years. But the beers have changed over time, right? It's not necessarily exactly the same recipe that they did 800 years ago.
Close, I bet.
Yeah. And why is that? Is it just technology, or their customers changed, or?
Well, it's probably a little of both, but definitely the technology part. I mean, we don't even have access to the same malt and hops that they used 500 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So that already changes those kinds of beers quite dramatically. And we didn't have, we have access when they didn't have access to pure cultures of yeast. So that probably changed things dramatically. And stainless steel hadn't been invented. Copper was expensive and hard to come by. So just the vessels they used were dramatically different than what we use today. I mean, I don't know this number for sure, but I think it's pretty close to zero of the number of people who still have a wooden mash tun.
I was at Hook Norton, and they have a wooden mash tun. It's I don't think they use it. They also had a coal-fired kettle, as well. And that's so that's 150 years ago, 170 years ago.
Yeah, Hook Norton's awesome. But most of the people who still have that old equipment, if they use it, it's very infrequently. It's for specialty things,
right?
And it's too difficult for us in this day and age to brew like they did 500 or 1,000 years ago. We brewed a sahti yesterday, and we went as traditional as possible, including heating up rocks, getting them red hot, and dropping them into the mash to bring the mash temperature up. Right. So we went super old school. It's being fermented in wood as we speak. We used a kuyt yeast, like they have on the rings that they would put in.
Right.
So you
went super authentic.
Even that beer.
You went super authentic.
Yeah, well, we did use a pump and hoses, and we didn't boil because they didn't boil those beers traditionally. So we skipped that part, but we did run off into our kettle to collect. We didn't use a wooden trough, but we tried to keep it as authentic to how they might have brewed 500 years ago as we could. We heated the rocks with oak,
Mm-hmm.
and Madrone,
Uh,
and we didn't have access to the kind of juniper that they used. So instead, I went out and cut redwood branches because that's what we have
mm-hmm.
locally that are available,
Mm-hmm.
and use those at the bottom of the mash tun to filter the beer.
Mm-hmm.
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it sounds like a blast. Well, so if somebody wanted to make sahti, what's a basic recipe they could start with?
Well, a lot of the satis are they use either there's a malt made somewhere in Scandinavia that's especially for those kinds of beers, but that's hard to get here.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the recipes that I looked at had Pilsner malt and some rye malt.
Right.
And the rye malt is usually a little bit darker, and then some folks that throw in some dark malt. Um, and we did ours. It was about 30% dark rye, a little handful of some special B, just a tiny bit, and then the rest was Pilsner malt. But there are a couple books that are really good. This Viking Age Brewing
Mm.
book, this is a great book. Has all kinds of good recipes and history of that kind of beer in there. And then, of course, there's Lars's book,
Mm-hmm.
which anybody who doesn't have it should have it because it's just so awesome. And I think Lars was his blog was where I first got turned on to this notion of how different ancient beers were, or
Mm-hmm.
the old brewing techniques, and they're just substantially different. When you don't have, most brewers had a very small metal pot, so they would do a separate wort boil with hops if they used hops at all, or
Mm-hmm.
you know some spices they might boil in there and add that back into the main. But the main, mash wasn't boiled. They
Mm-hmm.
would heat it with hot rocks and not boil, and then pour that side batch in, and then send it off to the wooden fermenters.
And did they use unmalted grains as well in sake?
Yeah, there's some discussion about unmalted grains. The literature on that kind of beer is scant, as it is on a lot of beers when you go back, more than about 500 years. A lot of the records they have were, for bookkeeping,
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily recipes and things. And oftentimes the brewers would guard those recipes as secrets. Some even making, their own secret language to write their recipes in. And so, it's hard to discern what the recipe might have been. Most of what we know about satis and those kinds of beers have been handed down in family traditions, and
Mm-hmm.
there's still quite a few farmhouse brewers still making these beers throughout, Scandinavia. And probably in reality, that method of making beer, heating up the mash with hot stones, probably was all across the European continent as well, because people they didn't have big metal vessels,
Mm-hmm.
and so they had to use wood. And last time I tried heating, wood over a fire, it didn't work so well. So you got no other choice. There's
Mm-hmm.
just, you have very limited ways to heat that mash up. And because they didn't have big enough vessels to boil the entire amount, they would either not boil at all, any of it, or they'd boil in a separate, smaller container.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had, what they call now raw beer.
Mm-hmm.
And some people will say, well, aren't they worried about infection? Well, they didn't even know about infection, so they weren't worried
Don't
about it.
worry about it, yeah.
And I suspect that 500 or 1,000 years ago, there were really kind of two real types of beer. There was either your lighter beers that were slightly sour,
Mm-hmm.
depending on the age
Right.
and how long they, had been allowed to become sour, or, big, strong beers that had alcohol to protect them.
Mm-hmm.
500 years ago, most breweries didn't use hops. So the antimicrobial, effect that hops have, wasn't part of the game. They
Mm-hmm.
used other herbs, some of which were antimicrobial, but a lot of which, just weren't.
So a lot of the commercial satis nowadays are around 8%. Do you think the more historic sati was lower or higher in ABV, or around 8%?
I'd guess somewhere in between 6 and 9, so eight's a kind of good middle number.
Hmm.
If you dip too much below 6, lactic acid bacteria will start, to do its job.
Hmm.
And without hops, it'll start even quicker.
Hmm.
And above, 7 or 8, you retard that some.
Hmm.
So I would assume that they're pretty big, and I don't think they'd be a whole lot bigger than 9 or 10, percent alcohol, because now you're putting a lot of material in,
Hmm.
which, is keeps the bacteria at bay, but it's also a lot more, cost intensive. And you got to think about brewing a beer like that. 500 or 1,000 years ago, you had to cut your own wood, grow your own malt, grow your own hops if you're going to use hops or herbs, or go out and pick them. The juniper branches they used for sahti as a filter bed. And there's records of breweries in Germany and the continent using similar methods with, branches for filter beds. You had to go out and pick those yourself. So your brew day wasn't easy. You had to, you know, split wood, dry it, grow your malt, dry it, malt it, because you can't just make
Hmm.
beer with grain. You have to malt it, and then you either have to dry it in the summer out in the sun and make what was called, in Germany anyway, Luftmalt, which is air malt that they dried out in the air, or you had to build a fire with your wood that you've collected and then, dry and,
Hmm.
roast your malt that way. So it was a lot of labor. And then you had to find all your rocks, and not every rock is going to work for this. For this
Right.
sahti we did, I went down on the bottom of our property. We got 28 acres, so we had some room, and I collected a bunch of different rocks and took them home and put them into my forge at home, and found out which ones would explode when added to liquid,
Did you have a
which,
bunch explode?
yeah, a lot.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was kind of dramatic. But I didn't want to do that in the beer.
Hmm.
So it turns out there are different types of rocks that are able to take that thermal shock a lot better. So
Hmm.
you have to then hand pick all your rocks and know what
Right.
you're looking for, and then build a big fire to heat them up.
Hmm.
That's a lot of work.
Hmm. Now, did you add any hops to this sati you brewed?
We did. We added some hops in the mash, which was kind of fun, which was a kind of a traditional thing. And I'm not sure how much, how many IBUs we're going to get out of that.
Hmm.
And then we did put some into the kettle, or our collection, vessel, while we were running off. And those will probably even have less effect because, the wort had cooled down some.
Mm.
But
Right.
there's definitely some hops in there.
Hmm.
I think there'll be more aroma than bitterness.
Hmm. When do you think this beer will be ready?
That's hard to say. The kuyt yeast is known for being quick, and
Uh-huh.
I checked it this morning. It's fermenting, and hopefully it'll be ready in a couple weeks, like a what we consider a normal beer nowadays.
Right.
But we made a Berliner Weiss this way a few months back. Well, actually about a year ago, and because of the co-fermentation with lactic acid bacteria, brewer's yeast, and Brettanomyces, that beer sat there for 9 months before it came, all together.
Hmm.
And it was a lot longer than we thought, but it was, similarly produced, and it was raw, no boil. And it was quite an interesting beer. It sold well, so people must have liked it, at least some.
Well, I want to ask you about a another Viking, time beer. But first, let's take a quick break, and we'll get more of historic beers right after this. All right, we're back. We're talking historic beers with my good friend and tremendous brewer and author, Fal Allen from Anderson Valley Brewing Company. So before the break, what was it that Vikings drank? Is it the Gotlandstrika? Is that the supposed Viking beer? Yeah, because you see in movies and stuff, they're all drinking mead, but at some point they started drinking beer, right? Is that you think mead was before that, or?
You know, it's hard to tell. There's a lot of information out there.
Hmm.
One of the problems is finding that information, and then of course trusting that information,
Right.
because I just read an article that talks about this book.
Hmm.
Did you read that article?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. Yeah.
How, that lambic brewers are wrong about almost everything.
Right.
And
About the origins of lambic, and yeah, yeah. Martin
yeah,
Cornell, he posted a thing too. I thought it was fascinating. He kind of went over the things in the book.
and turns out this book is now worth about $1,400. So now I'm
Right.
going on vacation when I sell it. But when this book first came out, it's a great book, and it's got well documented, but it's the argument is that they chose the things to document that they wanted to,
Hmm.
and that really there's a different history to lambics. And so even though something this thick, this good, with all high
Hmm.
quality, with pictures and everything, you think it's right, but now there is a question: is it right?
Right.
So it really depends on who you believe and who you listen to. And I found that when I was researching the Goza book, that there's a lot of opinions out there, and a lot of things are written down, and sometimes they're even contradictory. So you have to kind of sift through, and as a brewer, apply what you know about brewing to what the records say, and say, well, that makes sense. It
Hmm.
makes sense that Goza was sour because it
Hmm.
was a low alcohol beer that was made, somewhere starting, 900 or 1,000 years ago, and they didn't know anything about sanitation. So any beer that sat long enough was sour.
Hmm.
That makes sense, right?
Right. Right.
But you read other people that say, oh, no, it wasn't a sour beer. And you have to imagine how a 3% beer, unless it was consumed almost immediately, could
Right.
be
Less
anything
than
else but
sour.
sour.
Right. Well, I
So,
imagine they generally consume the lighter beers fairly quickly after brewing. The stronger beers were the ones for aging and keeping. Um,
yeah.
Depending on the seasons, things like that. But even then, by the time you ferment out a beer like that, with questionable amounts of yeast, it probably, you probably have a ton of bacteria in there just to start with. Yeah, I imagine it had some sourness even after just a few days.
And I think, when we co-fermented that Berliner Weiss, the Saccharomyces took off. And that was what expressed itself first. And
Hmm.
the lactic acid bacteria was pretty quick behind it.
Hmm.
So within a few days, that beer had already started to show a little sourness.
Hmm.
Now, it was very low gravity beer and didn't have a lot of alcohol or a lot of hops. And it then took about 6 months for the Brettanomyces to start showing.
Hmm.
So you probably could have made a strong, dark beer, and not had a lot of effect from the lactic acid bacteria, and stored it for, 3 to 6 months. But after that time, you have to start worrying about other things, like Brettanomyces is going to start to work. And so any beer that got to be a couple years old, I would think would probably have some sourness and some Brett flavor,
Hmm.
which sounds perfect to me.
Well, and so all these older beers, like Grodziski and Grisette, and a lot of these, one of the common things you see is smoky in the descriptor. uh Smoky, sour. Some of them weren't sour, and really, I guess that's from the malt processing. It was until they came up with coal or coke to malt their grains, heat their grains, dry their grains. They pretty much everything except for the air dried malt you mentioned would have been smoky.
Yeah, that that's my belief. I've had discussions with some other folks who have said that might not be the case necessarily, that they have drawings of ways that they would have indirect heat dry the malt.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that was probably true in the 17th and 18th, 19th century, maybe not the 17th, but definitely the 18th and 19th century. But prior to that, if you go back, far enough, I'm not sure that they had that technology. And even if they had it, it would have been on a much smaller scale, because it would have been just too difficult to build some of these things.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it was a world where everything was smoky.
Yeah.
That was the only way you cooked. That was the only way you heated things. So you had fires going all the time. So it was just part of your environment. So you
Yeah.
smell smoke, you don't mind it in things you're drinking. It just seems part of the natural world, I would imagine.
And like a lot of things, you're probably less aware of it because it surrounds you all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so you wouldn't, if you walked into a tavern in, 1550, first of all, no one had bathed in,
Right.
9 months to a year. So you had that aroma going on.
Uh-huh.
And then there was a fire going if it was winter.
Mm-hmm.
And, you've cooked, like you said, you've been cooking in the same clothes you've been wearing
Mm-hmm.
for, I don't know, weeks, months, and they're smoky. You've been warming yourself with fire. So everything was smoky and sweaty.
Mm-hmm.
You'd hardly notice that the beer was infected.
That the beer was smoky and sweaty. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I get back to the Gotland Strika. The description I see is smoky, bitter, sweet, with juniper. So like sahti, but what's the difference between those?
I don't know if I'm capable of answering that. I know that there are different styles with different recipes from Scandinavia, but different areas.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the sahti is a darker beer
Mm-hmm.
that's a little heavier and a little less smoky, although I think, as we pointed out, it probably was smoky
Mm-hmm.
back in the day. So I wanted to try and make one of those, but I thought that the name was so unusual and we would have trouble selling it.
Right.
We found that some of these ancient beers don't go over like an IPA.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to do it. I'll come down with a 5-gallon brew kit, and we'll brew 5 gallons. I'm sure
Absolutely,
you can
that'd be
sell 5
fantastic.
gallons.
We brewed a Gradzicki. I've been on this kind of 2-year program of brewing some of these ancient beers,
Mm-hmm.
and we brewed a Gradzicki, which 90% of the people are like, oh no. The other 10% love it.
Mm-hmm.
And even when I've been able to convince a bar owner or a pub owner, to take it on because they love it, they end up drinking most of it themselves at the bar.
And that's a smoked wheat beer. Now
Yeah.
a wheat like in Hefeweizen, or more like like a regular ale or a lager.
It's more like a regular ale. It's supposed to be hoppy and smoky,
Mm-hmm.
and it's 100% oak smoked wheat.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Weirman makes an oak smoked wheat just for people who want to make these beers. It's quite a nice malt, and that's what we used. And kind of, in my opinion, it's a nicely done, lightly smoked malt, but for a lot of people, it's just a bridge too far. And that, coupled with the fact that it's like 2.8 to 3.5% alcohol,
Right.
it's a hard sell at a retail place.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the bar owners I know say that people come in and say, basically, what's your strongest IPA?
Yeah. Well, it costs you probably the same to make a average IPA as it does the Gradzicki, cost wise, maybe even more. And a lower ABV, people don't care. They want alcohol.
Yeah.
All the claims of session beers and all that, people want alcohol.
It's true.
Funny. People drink for the alcohol.
Well, yeah. I enjoy these lower alcohol beers because I like the act of hanging out and drinking.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be, loopy on my 4th beer. So I like the low alcohol beers, but there are a lot of people who come in and, they want to order an IPA for whatever reason, and they want it to be strong.
Mm-hmm. Now, back in the day, you hear stories of people drinking, gallons of beer per day, and mainly, and so I've heard, oh, it's because you couldn't drink the water, and then there's other things that saying no, they just they like to catch a little buzz throughout the day. Other is for the nutrients. It was replaced meals for a lot of people. Uh, what so let's go back to the Grodzicki you made. What was your recipe on that? What's a general recipe if people wanted to try that sort of beer?
It was just 100% of that oak
Smoked
smoked
bowls
wheat malt,
or wheat?
and a decent amount of hops. And I knew that I didn't want to use a low alpha acid hop like they probably did back in the day, because there's a lot of, when you're boiling a lot of vegetable matter, you get a veggie flavor.
Right.
So I went for a higher alpha acid hop, which they probably wouldn't have had, well, they definitely wouldn't have had a couple hundred years ago. But I knew that it was going to be a challenge selling this beer anyway. So I wanted to keep it, as
Mm-hmm.
crisp and sharp as I could, and not too veggie.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of hops do you tend to favor on these older beers? Or these historic styles? When you obviously can't get the hops that they used, but do you tend to choose things in like a noble hop variety, something citrusy, something piney, something? You're certainly not going for like Simcoe and Mosaic, I don't think.
No. For the Grodzicki, I used Magnum,
No.
which it's high alpha,
Mm-hmm.
pretty low flavor impact. It's got a low cohumulone, so the bitterness is not harsh. And I like that hop for a kind of a neutral hop, but they certainly wouldn't have had something like that around. So if you're going to make something a little more traditional, the things that are still around are things like Fuggles and Goldings. Those have some nice kind of outdoorsy, grassy flavors. And then there's some German styles that we can get that are lower alpha acid that I think would probably have been around.
Mm-hmm. Adam in the chat writes, it kills me why so many people don't like smoked beers but love smoked meats. I love me some smoked beers. Please do it at least on the small system.
Yeah, well, it's going to take us a while to sell through the Grodzicki, so come on by and help us.
Yeah. Go on down, Adam. Have a couple of pints.
Yeah.
Well, and you could probably have 8 pints since it's what, around 3%?
It's like 3.2%. So yeah.
Oh yeah. And ton of flavor, and that's what I love about a lot of the British ales. I'm such a big fan of traditional British cask ale. It's just I can drink a ton of it, a ton of flavor, real interesting beers. Let's do this. Let's take our second short break, and when we come back, we'll talk more about historic beers right after this. All right, we're back. We're with Fal Allen talking about historic beers. Mike asks in the chat, he says, some breweries go way over the top on smoke. I like some smoke with my beer, but I don't want my beer to taste like smoked sausage.
I like smoked sausage.
Yeah. I anytime smoke's brought up, I've got to keep bringing up my story of I was in Houston for, I think it was the Dixie Cup, and when I got there, it was late. I went and had some barbecue, and in the morning they had at the competition they had a buffet. In the afternoon that was all sorts of foods that people brought to share, and one was this smoked chicken that was absolutely black with smoke. And when I was there, somebody I was just recently in Houston, was talking to somebody, and they go, oh yeah, it's such and such, it's chicken. And the smoke on that was so intense that after eating all this barbecue and this really intensely smoked chicken, the next morning when I went to pee, I could smell smoke.
Oh, wow.
So it's very surprising. You know, you get the asparagus pee, well, you can get smoked pee too.
Huh.
So
And now, challenge on. I'm
yes,
gonna have to
you
work
can.
for that. But I kind of agree with him that I think a lot of breweries do go too far.
Mhm,
And, you know, as a brewer, we're all subject to the I want to add a little bit more
mhm.
syndrome, which I found myself yesterday thinking about this sahti. I thought, well, we could add this or we could add that, or, they used herbs. Maybe we should add some sweet gale. But by and large, and, when brewers ask me, if I have any brewing advice other than keep it clean, is remain calm and even handed. Resist that urge to go over the top because, if you make 100% smoked Rauch beer with
Mhm,
that malt, it's just going to be too smoky,
mhm.
or if you use peated malt and use any more than just a few, 1 or 2%, it's going to be intense.
Right.
And sure, that's kind of fun for a sip or two, but
Mhm.
nobody wants a pint of some of these crazy beers that folks are making. It's too far.
Yeah, it can be a bit much, and the same goes with sourness, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, I had somebody tell me that, well, the intense, enamel stripping sourness was, American sour. I'm like, no, 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 yeah, it's just wrong.
Yeah.
Uh,
It's just wrong.
yeah, I enjoy a good sour beer, but not when it's that intense.
I think
Uh,
you can say the same thing with hops. You know,
all
you
right.
need balance. And if you have
Mhm.
something that's just this giant hop bomb, it's too bitter, too floral, just too over the top. I think, sure, interesting for a couple sips, but the brewer missed the mark.
Mhm. Yeah, balance is critical in brewing, I think, no matter what type of beer you're doing. Um, let's talk about let's see, another one, sour and smoky, the Lichtenheiner,
Yep.
sour, smoky, a third each of Pilsner, wheat, and smoked malt. Where does that one come from?
It comes out of that kind of area, Eastern Germany, south part of that, kind of like the Gradzitsky, just I think a little
Mhm,
west of there. There's uh, there's a beer like that that's not smoky, that's just sour. Then there's a beer that's smoky, one smoky, one is sour. And this is a combination of the two, which I think is
mhm,
very intriguing. I've only
right.
had that a few times. Um, Even here in the US, there are not a lot of craft brewers making them,
Mhm.
but I thought it was an intriguing combination of flavors.
Well, and it's difficult to get balance between sour, smoky, hoppy,
Yeah.
especially, anything that uses, a phenolic yeast, that's another element to balance in there. And that, the phenols from the smoke and the acidity of the sour. And, it's got to be tricky. I've not had any, and I'm curious, um, where to find some of these. Um, and I'm also fascinated at the number of these beers that are coming up now, because it seemed like for a long time, these weren't on anybody's radar.
I don't think they were on people's radar. They certainly weren't on mine, even as little as 10 years ago.
Hmm.
But, I judge a lot for the World Beer Cup or the GABF or other things. And a few years ago, I was judging the World Beer Cup and going down the list and thinking, I'm no longer a young brewer. I'm let's say middle-aged brewer. And I thought, I've made a lot of these beers and I haven't made this whole list here. And so I picked out the ones I'd never made that
Mm,
I thought would be fun. So the Gradzitsky and the Sahti, and we did a Dutch kuyt beer. I'm sure I'm pronouncing it wrong. Um, but we made, this whole historic set of beers. And there were since a few more on that list that have come
hmm.
up. which I'd like to try. I think Schops, a German Schops beer.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And so you touched on a point a minute ago, you hadn't had some of these. And the only ones that I've had of some of them are either my own or someone else's recreation of the style.
Hmm.
And I suppose to some degree, that's true no matter what, because even if you go to the source, it's a modern brewer brewing that beer. And
Hmm.
although the tradition may be there or may not be, you
Right.
know, as discussed earlier, they use different ingredients and different techniques and processes. So I think, it's interesting to try the beers at the source, but oftentimes the only source we have is our neighbors.
Hmm. Yeah. And I guess, we'll never know on some of these. Yeah, like you said, there's not a lot written down about them, and there's not a lot of evidence to go by, other than common sense brewing knowledge and knowledge of how brewing was done back then. Even 100 years ago, brewing was different,
Yeah.
and the ingredients were different, and the way that they recorded their information was different ways of sourcing materials.
And just they didn't use kilos, certainly,
Hmm.
in their
Right.
notes.
So
And
weird bushels and things
yeah,
like that. Yeah.
things that, sometimes there aren't any records of what that exactly meant.
Hmm.
And sometimes there are, but they're all in measurements that are unfamiliar to us. Like you said, bushels and bales and, different things. So it's hard to decipher some of these recipes. And, when Dick Cantwell and I were doing research for the barley wine book, we were lucky enough to get into the Bass Museum
Hmm.
and some of their archives. And, the things that we were reading were like, I don't see how this is possible. They're making like 40 barrels of beer and they're putting in like 9 bushels of hops.
Hmm.
And so some of it's just kind of like, all right, so how much is that? And
How
what
much
would
is it?
that
How
be
much is
like?
a cubit of malt?
Right.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah. I'm always fascinated by that, and I like you know trying old recipes and things like that. Um, it's always interesting to me. Uh, what other historic beers have you tried? And what about that Dutch one? You said there was a Dutch one that I hadn't heard of before.
Yeah, it's spelled Kuyt. It's spelled actually a bunch of different ways, but the spelling we chose was Kuyt.
Uh-huh.
And it's an oat beer. And
Oh,
I forget exactly what the percentage is, but I think it's 60 or 70% oats or more.
wow.
That's a lot of oats.
Yeah.
And so we were a little nervous when we made it. And in some countries, oats were used as an adjunct. They weren't as good as the malt. The cheaper
Hmm.
beers would have oats in them. And then in other countries where they're growing much higher quality oat, they would actually, use it to enhance the flavors of the beers. So it's kind of hard to tell where this one falls. It's probably in the latter, where they are trying, they had a good flavored beer come from the oats. But with that much oats, you're gonna have to use some rice hulls in there,
Hmm.
or be prepared to, run off for quite a few hours. So it was an interesting beer. They're supposed to be very hoppy, and they were very kind of rich in flavor from the oats.
Hmm.
And we managed to sell through it quite quickly. So it's one of the few that we might actually do again.
What ABV?
It was like 6,
Hmm.
not too big.
And did you use like flaked oats, or did you use any malted oats?
We didn't use any malted oats. We used a lot of flaked and some rolled oats,
Hmm.
the pre-gelatinized.
Right.
So it made it a little bit easier for us. And we used a lot of rice hulls, which I think is
Mhm.
in anybody who isn't using rice hulls, it's a great additive, has very, almost no flavor, maybe none.
Right.
and it really builds a nice mash bed. So we use it on any of our beers that are going to be more than about 6% alcohol.
Hmm.
We just, use varying amounts, and it helps build that mash bed and makes your runoff just so much easier.
Right.
So we use those in there, and it's supposed to be an intensely bitter beer. And they talk about boil times of up to 3 hours. So we boiled with hops for about 2 hours.
Mm.
So, 2.5 hour boil with 2 hours of hops.
Interesting. I'm gonna have to try that one
Yeah.
because it does sound like it could be quite good. I'm always fascinated by these things.
And I
And
think
yeah.
there are a lot of these beer styles out there
Hmm.
that have been, some of them completely lost, and there's only names. And then other ones that there is some, detail that you can dig up, and a lot of folks haven't, dug them up yet.
Hmm.
But most of the beers we've talked about today, 20 years ago, I'd, never heard of, and most people have never heard of.
Right.
And it's folks doing research for some of the books that have found them
Hmm.
either kind of collaterally, or it's been what they've been looking for. I know when we did the research for the Goza book, I found a lot of information that wasn't necessarily related to Goza, but really kind of piqued my interest,
Hmm.
like the that sour smoky beer, the Lichtenheim,
Hmm.
which I thought would, you know, be a very interesting beer.
Right. And when you brew these, how are you getting the souring? Are you pitching a lactoculture, or what are you doing for the souring?
It kind of depends on the beers. So for our Gozas, we do the kettle sours
Hmm.
in-house with a lactic acid bacteria that, we know exactly what it is. And for some of these other ones, we will sometimes just kind of let things go.
Hmm.
Sometimes we'll co-ferment, so we'll pitch some of that lactic in with the rest of the yeast and things. So it really kind of depends on the beer. We've had limited success with culturing bacteria from the property. We do have a culture that we use that's kind of a multiculture that we've harvested from the property, but
Hmm.
it gives varying results too. So I guess it kind of depends on what you're going for. We've tried pretty much every approach out there with varying success.
Right. What's your favorite on souring? Lower alcohol uh, beer.
I really like the co-fermenting. I
Hmm.
think, if you have the capability of doing that, you get the most interesting flavors. And like we did with the Berliner Weiss, those flavors kind of melded very nicely. And so you get a little bit of the kind of sharp, because we pitched it with lactic. We didn't just let it, come out from the wood. We pitched it, so we got a nice kind of clean intensity, but it also, since it was co-fermented and it was in wood the entire time, it brought out some of the other flavors that you might not get from like just a kettle sour.
Hmm.
But
Interesting.
those kind of, wood soured beers, whether you're pitching them or not, they take a lot longer. You got to be patient.
Hmm. And then, yeast wise, you're going with. Uh, I mean, it just depends, I guess, on the beer. You mentioned kuyt, but I imagine you could use almost any ale yeast in a lot of these.
Yeah, we use our house yeast for things that aren't necessarily yeast driven.
Hmm.
A few months back, we had a homebrew contest here, and the winner had a saison that was very yeast driven in flavor. And when the winner gets to brew the beer here at the brewery, so he came and brought the yeast with him, and it was a Lallemand dried yeast.
Hmm.
And I'd tried dried yeast in the past some and had varying success, mostly not great. But this Lallemand technology, they've those dried yeasts come a long way, and
Yes.
Lallemand is making some really nice ones. So I was very impressed with that saison yeast that we used from them, And when we went to do the sahti yesterday, I got some of their kuyt yeast.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it's not cheap, but I think the quality is good. And that if you're not constantly brewing, if you're not a professional brewer, it used to be that you didn't have very many options. But now with these dried yeasts, I think they're good enough and inexpensive enough that you can use them to brew at home or to brew it commercially and not have to worry about saving your yeast, which,
Mm-hmm.
you know, can be difficult,
Right.
particularly
Yeah.
for home brewers.
The cost of a pitch, it's significant, and commercially, when you can, reuse your yeast many times, as a home brewer, that can be tricky unless
Yeah.
you want 100 gallons of saison. Yeah, you end up having to just dump the yeast. Speaking of yeast and where you can get all these ingredients that we talked about, I bet you can get them through my good friends at Josh and RJ at Brew Chatter. I don't know if you've been up to Reno, Fal, recently. There's
I have, and shout out to Brewer's Cabinet up there.
Brewer's Cabinet, yes.
Yeah,
I've
they're
been by
good
there
guys.
many
Make great
times.
beer.
Yeah. I enjoy the Brewer's Cabinet. I'm sure every once in a while they at Brew Chatter, they probably have some of that beer available in their store. They got a little bar in there. They got and they got all the ingredients, fresh ingredients, lots of knowledge, really nice guys. They're a sponsor of this show. So next time you're up in Reno, swing by Brewers Brewers Cabinet and our friends at Revision and Lead Dog, and oh man, I draw a blank on all. There's too many great breweries up there.
Yeah,
Breweries,
really.
distilleries, fun place.
Yeah,
So
Reno's really.
Stop in at Brew Chatter and tell them I sent you.
Yeah.
So sorry, go ahead.
No, Reno's really changed a lot. I mean, last 10 years, there's a ton of good places and a ton of good breweries up there, and a lot to do.
Yeah, I remember I used to go up there to judge with the Washoe Zephyr Zymergists and the homebrew club up there. And, pretty much back then, the only place there was Tom's place, Great Basin.
Yeah.
And that was great, but, it was kind of the only one. And then, but, a lot of passion home brewers now, they're opening up places, and yeah, the whole scene has really changed. Reno's kind of come a long way when it comes to food and beverages.
Yeah, Beer NV, also a great place with a lot of beers.
Yes, Beer NV. Yeah, just you can spend a week up there and not hit all the great places.
And then you could also hit some not so great places on purpose. They got a good dive bar scene up there too.
All right, one more short break, and then we'll wrap up talking about historic beers right after this. All right, we're back. We're talking historic beers. What should people know if they want to get into finding more of these historic beers? You mentioned a couple of good books. Is there any websites or things like that are really tracking this sort of thing? Are there competitions for ancient styles? Or
I'm sure there are competitions for ancient styles somewhere, and I don't know of any websites, but there are a lot of good books. And
your Goza book, for one.
Oh yeah, the Goza book, definitely.
Yeah, that's a good one. History of Beer and Brewing. The
Barbarian's Beverage.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these have limited knowledge for techniques and recipes, but they do talk about a lot of these beers and put them into a kind of a cultural context, which I think is really, really interesting. One of the reasons that you might want to make a Viking beer is because you think the culture is cool, and
or you have relatives or something, or it's in your ancestry. Sure.
Yeah. And there's I think pretty much around the globe, everybody was making some sort of, fermented beverage
Hmm.
500, 1,000 years ago. And I think a lot of these have been forgotten or are now so hyperly locally made that people don't know about them. Like, a lot of these Scandinavian beers were just completely unknown because no one had written about them. They're still being made in farmhouses, but nobody had documented them very well. I know that Lars, when he went to start documenting them, he had some trouble, and he actually went out to a lot of these farmhouses and hung out and brewed with them. And that's kind of one of the things that makes his book so interesting.
Hmm. Yeah, it is a really good book. It's a lot of fun. Yeah, I think if you're interested in brewing, you should be interested in the history of brewing, because it's amazing how it changed. I was just working on a presentation I have to do, and one of my slides was just in the last 10 years, all the trendy things that have come up. Back a decade ago, it was still like the big thing was, double IPA, triple IPA. Ooh, and then it started going into, a lot of the sours, pastry stouts, the smoothies, the, seltzers, all these things in a decade, very rapidly. Um, just the acceleration of people exploring new styles and different, brewing. It's fascinating. And a lot of it comes from, historic beers, the smoky, the sour, all those things. So it was kind of cool. All right. If you enjoy the show, you enjoy listening to it, make sure that you check out our sponsors, Blickman Engineering, blickmanengineering.com. You can send a nice email to feedback@blickmanengineering.com. Go straight to John Blickman himself, and he gets to hear, how good or horrible the show is that he pays for. And also check out our friends, Josh and RJ at Brew Chatter. If you're up around Reno, they're actually in Sparks. You stop in there. They'll have great beer on, really super friendly guys, very knowledgeable, and they'll have everything you need to brew a lot of these historic beers. If they don't have it in the shop, they'll get it for you. So go check them out. Until then, everyone, brew strong.